They built one of the most powerful empires in human history. Spanish galleons crossed every ocean. Portuguese navigators mapped the coastlines of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. For 5 centuries, the Iberian Peninsula projected its language, its religion, and its culture across half the globe. The story of Spain and Portugal is, on its surface, one of the most thoroughly documented stories in Western history. Roman conquest. Visigoth kingdoms. 8 centuries of Moorish rule. The Reconquista. The Inquisition. The Age of Discovery. Layer after layer of recorded history, each one apparently explaining the people who live there today. Every schoolchild in Madrid or Lisbon can recite the outline. The dates, the rulers, the battles, the treaties. The story seems complete, and yet the DNA tells a different story. Not a contradictory one, exactly, but a deeper one. One that reaches beneath every layer the history books describe and finds something older, something stranger, and something that no chronicler of Rome or Carthage or the Umayyad Caliphate ever thought to record. Because what the ancient DNA of the Iberian Peninsula reveals is that the people who were there first, before the Romans, before the Phoenicians, before anyone whose name we know, were unlike anything the standard model of European prehistory predicted. And the echoes of those people are still present in the genomes of modern Spaniards and Portuguese in ways that have only recently become visible. To understand the discovery, you have to understand what geneticists expected to find. The Iberian Peninsula, like the rest of Western Europe, was supposed to show the standard 3-layer pattern. First, the ancient hunter-gatherers who arrived in Europe tens of thousands of years ago. Then, the Neolithic farmers from Anatolia who brought agriculture around 8,000 years ago. And finally, the steppe pastoralists, the Yamnaya, whose massive migration into Europe around 4,500 years ago brought Indo-European languages and a substantial genomic transformation across the continent. Every Western European population carries DNA from all 3 of these ancestral streams. The proportions vary, but the recipe is fundamentally the same everywhere, except it isn't. Not in Iberia. Not entirely. When researchers began extracting and sequencing ancient DNA from burial sites across Spain and Portugal at scale, a process that accelerated dramatically through the 2010s and into the 2020s, they found the expected layers. But they also found something the model had not predicted, a signal, persistent, localized, and genetically distinct, a population component present in ancient Iberian remains that did not fit cleanly into any of the 3 founding streams. Something that appeared to represent a 4th ancestral source, one that had left a stronger mark on the Iberian Peninsula than on virtually any other region of Western Europe. The signal pointed, with increasing statistical confidence, toward North Africa, not toward the Moorish conquest of 711 CE. That was already accounted for in the historical record and visible in more recent genomic layers. This was older, much older. Pre-Roman, pre-Phoenician. A North African genetic component embedded in ancient Iberian populations from the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods, thousands of years before any historically documented contact between the 2 shores of the Western Mediterranean. A 2019 study published in Science, involving the analysis of over 400 ancient Iberian genomes spanning a period from the Mesolithic to the early medieval era, documented this North African signal with unprecedented resolution. The researchers found that during the late Neolithic and Copper Age, roughly 3,000 to 2,500 BCE, there was a clear influx of ancestry from populations with North African affinities into the Iberian Peninsula. This was not a minor statistical artifact. It was a population-level event, visible in multiple burial sites across southern and eastern Iberia, leaving a genetic mark that persisted through subsequent millennia and can still be detected, faintly but measurably, in modern Spanish and Portuguese genomes today. What this means in plain terms is that the prehistory of the Iberian Peninsula included a significant movement of people across what is now the Strait of Gibraltar, a crossing of perhaps 14 kilometers of open water. At a time when we had assumed the 2 shores of the Western Mediterranean were developing in relative isolation, someone crossed, in significant numbers. They settled. They mixed with the existing population. And they left a genetic record that 5,000 years of subsequent history, Roman roads, Gothic kingdoms, Islamic caliphates, Catholic monarchies could dilute but not erase. The deeper question is why this crossing happened at all. The Strait of Gibraltar in the Neolithic era was not the geopolitical boundary it would later become. It was simply a narrow body of water between two landmasses that shared a climate, shared coastal ecologies, and shared the fundamental human impulse to move toward resources and away from scarcity. The populations of what is today Morocco and Algeria were, genetically and culturally, closer to the populations of southern Iberia than either was to the populations of Central Europe. The Mediterranean was not a barrier in this era, it was a corridor. And the western end of that corridor, the narrow passage where Africa and Europe almost touch, was one of the most active sections of that ancient human highway. The genomic signal left by those crossings is the biological record of a connection that predates every empire, every religion, and every national identity that would later claim this landscape as its own. But the North African signal is only part of the story, because the Iberian Peninsula has another genetic secret, one that runs in the opposite direction chronologically. While the ancient Iberians were receiving population from the south, they were simultaneously developing something internally that made them genetically distinct from the rest of Europe in a different way. The steppe migration that swept across most of Western Europe between 4,500 and 4,000 years ago arrived in Iberia later, and with less force than anywhere else on the continent. The Yamnaya-related ancestry that dominates the genetic profiles of modern Northern and Central Europeans is present in Iberian genomes, but at significantly lower levels. Iberia received the wave, but the wave was weaker by the time it arrived at the western edge of the continent. The result of these two forces, an unusual North African input from the south and a reduced steppe input from the north and east, is a genomic profile that makes modern Spaniards and Portuguese measurably distinct from other Western Europeans in ways that population genetics is only now fully characterizing. They are not a simple mixture of the standard European three. They are something more complicated, more layered, more specifically shaped by the particular geography of a peninsula that juts into the Atlantic at the southwestern corner of the continent. Flanked by Africa to the south and isolated by mountains to the northeast. And then there are the Iberians themselves, the people who gave the peninsula its ancient name. The Iberians were a pre-Roman civilization that flourished in the eastern and southeastern regions of the peninsula from roughly the 6th century BCE until Roman conquest. They left behind art, inscriptions, urban settlements, and a language that has never been fully deciphered. Iberian is not Indo-European. It is not related to Latin or Greek or any Semitic language. Like Basque, it stands largely alone, a linguistic island whose full connections remain unclear. For decades, history argued about whether the Iberians were indigenous to the peninsula or had arrived from North Africa in antiquity. The ancient DNA is now beginning to settle that argument, and the answer supports the North African connection in ways that the archaeology had only hinted at. There is a moment, reading through the genomic studies of ancient Iberia, where the scale of what was happening becomes genuinely disorienting. You are looking at a peninsula that was, for much of European prehistory, a kind of genetic laboratory. Populations arriving from the east, from the steppe, encountered a resident population that was already more North African influenced than any comparable European region. The Beaker culture, the archaeological phenomenon associated with the steppe migration's westward push, arrived in Iberia and did something unusual. It replaced a very large fraction of the existing male population, based on Y chromosome analysis, while absorbing significant portions of the existing female population, based on mitochondrial analysis. The genetics of this replacement are stark. In some Iberian sites, the transition from pre-Beaker to Beaker-era burials shows an almost complete replacement of Y chromosome lineages within a few generations. What caused this demographic asymmetry, whether it was violence, social structure, or some combination of both, the DNA cannot tell us, but the scale of it is unmistakable. What survived through all of this? Through the Beaker replacement, through Phoenician and Greek colonization, through Carthaginian occupation, through Roman conquest, through the Visigothic migrations, through 8 centuries of Moorish rule. through the Reconquista and the expulsions of Jews and Muslims that followed, was a genomic core that still carries the traces of every one of these encounters. Modern Spaniards and Portuguese are not simply Romans who speak a Latin-derived language. They are a palimpsest, a document written and rewritten dozens of times, each layer leaving traces beneath the surface of the current text. There is a woman living today in Seville whose genome carries, in measurable proportion, the genetic signature of a population that crossed the Strait of Gibraltar 5,000 years ago. She also carries the traces of the steppe migration, of Roman-era admixture, of the North African Berber populations that arrived with the Moorish conquest, and of the complex centuries of mixing and separation that followed. None of these layers cancels the others. They accumulate, the way all human history accumulates, into something that resists simple summary and cannot be reduced to a single origin or a single identity. The history books of Spain and Portugal are among the most detailed in the world. The Iberian Peninsula has been written about, analyzed, and debated for over 2,000 years. And yet none of that writing captured what the ancient DNA is now revealing, that the story begins thousands of years before the first written record. In movements of people across a narrow strait of water that connected two worlds, the historical imagination kept separate. The Romans did not create the Iberians. The Moors did not define them. The Catholics did not purify them. All of these powers passed through a landscape that was already ancient, already layered, already shaped by crossings and minglings that history never recorded, because history had not yet begun. The DNA was always there. In the bones beneath the Roman forums, in the teeth recovered from Copper Age burial mounds, in the genomes of people alive today who carry in their cells the record of every population that ever crossed this particular corner of the world. The science arrived thousands of years late, but it arrived, and what it found is that the story of Spain and Portugal is older, stranger, and more connected to the wider human world than anyone had imagined. History is not written in books. It is written in genomes, and the Iberian genome has been writing its story for 5,000 years, waiting for someone to learn how to read it.